and welcome to Blockchain Gaming World, episode 135. I'm your host, John Jordan, and joining me today we have Kam Punia, who is the CEO at Pixion Games, based in London. How's it going, Kam?
Hi, John. Good to be here and good to catch up again.
Yes, but it has been a while. So we've got plenty to talk about. Fableborne being the game you've been working on for a while now, and are sort of making good progress on that. But before we kick into the game, there is a bit of news, which is sort of the timing of this podcast. So you've just announced a funding round. So what do you want to tell us about your funding round?
Yes, obviously it's been a tough market, as I'm sure many other founders and non-founders can testify to. But we're very happy that we've been able to close a round of 5.5 million US dollars, and we've got some incredible investors that have really believed in us, really backed the team, the studio, but also have a lot of fun when they play test Fableborne, likes of the Avalanche Blizzard Fund to Merit Circle, Shima Capital. We've got some great guys from Asia like Mechanism Capital as well. So really happy with the partners that we're now surrounded by.
Good. How was it as a process? Blood out of a stone sometimes, I guess. I mean, just for people who are not in the space, it's obviously this time last year you would have that would have been a very easy sort of thing to do. Whereas over the last year, obviously, just funding has just absolutely dried up for pretty much obvious reasons. So
it's definitely the hardest market I've ever personally raised in. Speaking to other founders, there have been term sheets being pulled left, right, and center.
Yeah.
Deals that were basically over the line being pulled. So it was definitely a very, very difficult period. And in between that, you had obviously Luna collapsing, you had FTX and everything else in between. So it was a really challenging, what's already a challenging experience, right? For any founder, I'm sure, even harder. But like I say, I think there's also been a benefit that it's really cleared the deck in terms of the teams and the experience of those teams, but also on the other side of the table, the investors, those investors that are really looking for short-term flips and looking for tokens to essentially use as exit liquidity at the expense of the teams and the communities. They're just not there anymore. And so on both sides, you've got teams that really believe in the space that are trying to deliver a new experience, but then you've got investors backing these teams that also have the same amount of conviction. So strong teams will continue to raise capital. The benefit I'd say now is that there's really credible investors on the opposite side of the table too.
Yeah. And it's good, looking at the round as well. You got sort of, as you say, sort of a good mixture in terms of the sorts of companies out there. You mentioned the geography, but you got a couple of guilds in there. So you got Merit Circle and is it Ready Player DAO. You got the Avalanche guys. Obviously, your Fableborne is running on Avalanche, so it's good to get, I guess, some support from the sort of the local ecosystem, and then sort of a range of sort of known investors in the space as well, and including a couple of existing investors. So you sort of tick a lot of the boxes that I guess people look for when they look to people like me when they look to dissect funding rounds.
Yeah,
how they do this.
Definitely. Like I say, it was a really challenging raise, and we had to say no to some capital as well.
Okay,
and, that's really tough.
Good.
That's really tough. Particularly in this market, particularly as a founder when fundraising is very difficult anyway. But we had conviction in ourselves, in the game, in the team, but also we had the support. It's easy to do that when you have investors already on your cap table pushing you to say, we will back you, find the right partners that will elevate the vision, help you execute on the vision and elevate the studio. When you have that trust, it's easier to find the right investors and have the conviction to walk away if it's not the right partner for you.
Yeah. Good. So that bit of the journey hopefully done for the time being. Let's move on to Fableborne as a project, but let's sort of go back in time, because this is a you've gone through a fairly long process. You didn't start off with Fableborne. You started off with some things turning out in Fableborne, didn't you? So maybe before we go into exactly what Fableborne is, maybe talk a bit about what you left on the cutting room floor during the process.
Our journey to Fableborne, yeah, there's quite a few games in the graveyard. So we are very intentional with what we spend our time on. Also we've got a really experienced team. So
Mm,
most of us have worked in the industry, mostly free to play,
yeah,
for the last 10 plus years. Worked on games that have had tens of millions of downloads, hundreds of million in lifetime revenue, and we've been in pivotal senior leadership roles in those studios to get those games there. And so, although in blockchain, I always say, because there's no playbook to follow, experience doesn't really tell you what to do. It does tell you what not to do
yeah,
in
yeah,
some instances.
yeah,
And so we really lean on that. And that gives us a really good radar and barometer to gauge, can we build this game to the same scale or larger? And if we don't have that conviction internally straight away after a prototype, we kill the game, which is always hard to do, regardless of whether it's 8 weeks or eight
mm,
months you've been building it. And we learn our lessons, we do our post mortem, and we take those lessons into the next prototype. And like I say, we've killed 5 games over the last 3 years,
okay, mm,
some that have been 10, 12 weeks into development, and we've played it. We've not even stealth launched it. We've played it, and on paper it sounds great. We're
mm,
super excited, and we play it and go, actually, guys, this is not definitely not the one.
yeah,
We don't have a belief we can build this into a category defining kit, so let's put it to one side. To actually releasing something, it's in soft launch, it's generating revenue, but we're just not able to scale it, and we have to sunset it as well.
mm,
So all of them have that same, let's say, framework. So games that have a high skill cap, but so require mastery, but
mm,
are really accessible and can be played in these short, snackable sessions.
yeah,
Have competitive play as a core component to the meta game, and so we always build around that sort of framework and iterating
mm,
consistently. If we do get to a point where we're very bullish on the game, we then essentially build out an MVP, put that into a stealth launch, and always look at generally 4 main KPIs: retention, daily playtime, number of sessions per player, and then a KPI specific to the game. For Fableborne, it's number of raids per day.
mm,
For other games, it's number of battles, number of matches. And that gives us then a health check on, okay, without any on chain layer, without any competitive layer or any deep metal progression mechanics, is the core loop just really fun? Is it
mm,
keeping players coming back day after day after day? And is it a strong base to build those layers on top of? And if we cannot be very confident at that point that it's a yes, and the data is informing us also at this point now, it's a yes, we again kill the game. And so we eventually got to Fableborne. We started to prototype this pitch, and actually the pitch from the team was blending 2 genres together to create this really diverse meta game for multiple different player personas and player motivations.
mm,
And all on paper that sounded cool. Okay, great, but what's the actual game? And the pitch from the game design team was, think Clash of Clans meets Diablo,
mm,
with 2 main differences. Firstly, in Diablo, those worlds that you're raiding, they're created by the studio, us, the game designers, the team. In Fableborne, they're created by players and can be owned by players. So user-generated content is natively part of a core loop.
mm,
The world you build and the world I build, we all raid, and then there's content for each other.
yeah,
And then the second point is, unlike in traditional base building games, where you drag and drop units when you're raiding, and then the experience is quite idle, you watch
mm,
the action unfold. Here you have complete control. You decide what to attack, how to attack, when to attack. You control that hero. And so
mm,
the end result is a much more engaging, or we believe a much more engaging raiding experience, much more action packed, much more watchable,
mm,
but also much more satisfying because you have so many clutch moments that you've created yourself
mm,
on the fly. And, every player will have a different raiding experience. So that was the pitch from the
yeah,
team. We thought, okay, on paper, as always, sounds great, but let's prototype this and see if it stacks up.
Mm,
And what we found really early on is we were very excited because we had this really strong self-serving loop. Is that we'd all build different bases, even if it's with the same units. We'd have
yeah.
different layouts, we'd have different strategies. Some would try and create a really early block and just try and bombard you with units. Others would try and methodically create a corridor for you to
Mm,
go down and then bombard you. So it was really interesting to see everyone's strategies change with just a small amount of units.
yeah.
But then what was really exciting for us is watching each other raid the same base. And
Mm,
every raid was different.
yeah.
And that's where we thought, okay, this is really exciting because just this small amount of content is creating an exponential amount of different ways to play the game. And therefore, that's going to really increase the skill cap. It's going to require mastery, things to learn, and keep things really exciting.
Mm,
And so, okay, that's step one done.
yep.
We've got something we believe in. Let's prototype this or build an MVP, put it out into a stealth launch, and get a real health check on the KPIs. Fortunately, sixth time lucky, we we got some really strong data, and that
Mm,
then gave us the confidence that we should spend more time, we should put more resources into this.
yep.
And that's then when we put Fableborne into production, what, nearly 16 months ago now.
Okay. Well, cool. And I guess maybe I'll do my explanation, and you can tell me if I'm how correct I am. So as you say, people will basically own effectively they're sort of like floating islands if you look at them, and they're sort of they're relatively sort of the ones I've seen are sort of relatively small, not these massive these things, but they're sort of like various different shapes, and then you have sort of defensive armaments and traps and things that you just sort of lay out. Um, as you say, as you see fit, however you want to sort of lay your defenses, and then players sort of materialize in, and they have to make their way through the base, and then they basically sort of I can't remember what it's called actually. But you sort of you destroy like the HQ. It's
Yeah,
not an HQ, but it's like a sort of fantasy style HQ, and as you sort of attack the base, you're sort of gaining, you're sort of basically stealing the resources from that, and I guess another nice touch was with your character. Obviously, your character sort of can, if you maybe make it through and your character hasn't died, but if your character does die, there's a sort of you have to then sort of spend resources to sort of build them back up again. So there's
yes,
in blockchain we're often looking about sort of how a resource is spent in the game, and that's sort of quite a nice sort of there's quite a nice holistic sort of way of that risk reward. I think some people just don't care about
exactly.
the risk; they go for the reward. But other people are a bit more cautious. But as you say, that's adding different sorts of play sort of styles inherently into the game, which is you're sort of getting that for free. That's the sort of the psychological thing.
Exactly. And what's really exciting there is even when you're away from the game,
Mm,
you're still participating because your base might be attacked and
yeah,
you come back, watch the replay of how you
mm,
absolutely destroyed your hero,
yeah,
your opponent's hero,
yeah.
and you get rewards for that.
Okay. Mm,
And so that's really exciting that there's these two very different core components of the game. The raiding aspect,
mm,
where you control the hero and you decide, like I say, what to attack and how to attack that base. But then when you're away, all the work that you've just done in setting your base and trying to optimize this defense system that you've created
mm,
gets put to work. And that is really satisfying, particularly when you come in and you go, wow, look, I've just stolen tons of gold and now I can
yep,
spend it on this unit while I was away from the game,
yeah,
at school or on the bus or on a call.
mm, mm.
And so that was really exciting to see players discover that core loop as well and that feedback loop.
It's almost like the farming mechanic in like Farmville, isn't it? You want to come. Although they had Wither, didn't they? So I remember that being sort of quite controversial. That something if you came into Farmville at the wrong time, all your crops had withered, which was a really bad experience. But obviously they were driving you to come back to make sure they hadn't withered. But I think it's always nice to come back to a game and you go, oh, there's some stuff for me to pick up. It's a very light psychological boost, but
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
sort of nice. Yeah.
Exactly, and if you don't, there's a feedback loop there to watch replays
Mm,
and try and optimize. Say, okay, well, how did this hero get past? What
yeah.
did they do? Should I tweak my defense? Should I move this unit here? Should I upgrade that unit, or even buy a
Mm,
new unit?
yeah. Yeah.
And so we're excited by all the different possibilities that
Mm.
players are going to create. And that's the beauty of the core loop, is that, we're not creating those bases. It's
Yeah.
all player created, and
Mm.
we're excited to, see what we build.
Have to say, it sort of reminds me. I was probably the only person in the world who really enjoyed the free to play version of Dungeon Keeper, where they had a really deep sort of, you're building your dungeon, and people would
Yeah,
attack it. But that was very controversial back in the day because it was free to play, and Peter Molyneux had this sort of got all caught up in that. Anyway, we won't go into that. So anyway, so thinking about more about Fableborne. So you've spent, you've come up with 5 games, killed them, got one you like, done some testing around it, can see, it's got a lot, hopefully a lot of potential. Obviously, you need to polish it and stuff. So, at what point? I mean, I know you're already planning on this, but to some outsider, you go, we've got a really interesting mobile game. Should point out you're a free to play mobile studio. That's always what you're looking to do.
yes,
Um, so why don't you just go to investors and go, we've got this great free to play mobile game. It's going to be really, it's got this great sort of, you can play it in different ways. It's got this, sort of like, we'll talk about the esports bit maybe. It's got sort of some elements of that. We think it's really good. Why'd you go? And now we're going to add blockchain. So that's always the question we sort of get asked in the space. Why blockchains? Yeah, technology, but no one needs it. It's not giving us anything. It's giving us
sure,
complexity.
sure. So we started looking at blockchain back in 2020,
Mm.
and myself, I've invested in VV, the blockchain marketplace with all the
Oh yeah,
digital licensed
yeah.
collectibles. Is extremely successful. They were looking at blockchain technology in 2017
Mm.
when I invested. I've obviously been into crypto slightly longer before that. And so I've always been really excited about the technology. Didn't really understand or look at how it can be implemented in gaming. And so after we
Mm.
killed our fourth title back in 2020, we started to look at blockchain, and VV was starting to also gain traction. So I had one eye as being on the board and being able to see that entire ecosystem grow and all the things they
Yeah.
had to experiment with. I started to see how that was engaging this community. And of course, Axie hadn't started to
Yeah.
explode, but you could start to see the breadcrumb trail, and the low hanging fruit. And that's when we started to really think about, is this potentially the next paradigm shift in gaming? And when I think of paradigm shifts in gaming, I always center it again around the monetization loop or the
Okay.
monetization model. And
Mm.
we can go back in history to validate that. Obviously now we were at free to play, and that was play play forever and pay never potentially.
Yeah.
And then prior to that, we had premium games, which was play once or play forever and pay once. And then prior to that, we had arcade, which was play once, pay once.
Mm.
And so each of these different monetization models has created a few different shifts. One, how as us as a team, as game designers, think about creating that content. And then two, how players actually experience and consume that content. And that then fundamentally changes the gaming landscape as we've seen over the last 3 decades. And so when we start to look at, or particularly when I start to look at VV and how they were monetizing their players, but also how players were consuming this digital collectible content and what they were doing with that digital collectible, we start to think about, well, what does that do to gaming? And we always center it around two main questions. How does this technology either create a completely new experience that doesn't exist
Mm-hmm.
for players, or two, how does it exponentially improve the player experience
Yeah.
that currently exists? And we go back to those two questions all the time. And if we can't come up with real reasons, reasons that add value to the player, then we just wouldn't add a technology, because
Mm.
as you see and as everyone knows, there's a lot of barriers still. There's a lot of UX challenges. There's a lot of unknown unknowns, the regulatory side, etc. So you have to have real conviction that what you're building actually really improves the experience, rather than it just being another piece of technology that allows you to create the same experience. So
Mm.
we had that conviction. We went back and forth quite a lot.
Mm.
We obviously prototyped what that could look like in our fifth title that we killed, and then we learned a lot about that, but also learned a lot in observing the industry. We've been very intentional with not releasing a token
Yeah.
not releasing an NFT collection before having a game that we can scale,
Yeah.
or believing a game that we have can scale. And so we focus still always on, the fundamentals of those two questions. How do we build an experience that is either new, players haven't had it before, or exponentially improves what they're currently playing?
Mm. Mm. I guess sort of continuing that on, this is a game where people don't need NFTs to play. They can
Correct.
play. I mean, the main NFT element is the sort of the character you're actively playing with the active controls, as you sort of pointed out. So people obviously get one of those for free if they're playing the game. If people want to come in and buy an NFT, one of that, where they can sort of choose different rarities and stuff, they can do that as well. But and there's sort of two different paths there. And you have a path for, I guess, the best or the better free players can maybe win an NFT through sort of tournament structure. So you're sort
Yeah.
of leaving it very open.
Yeah. So the first few sessions absolutely are going to be exposing the player to the core game. If you
Mm.
don't have a player that retains and engages, you've
Yeah,
got no economy.
yeah,
And so the first few sessions are going to be focused around the core game, the building mechanics, why and how to raid effectively, why it's important to build a base.
mm.
And then, of course, we've got a couple of ideas on how we onboard players. One you obviously mentioned is with different heroes. And since you can take free heroes into any raid, you're going to be
Okay.
incentivized to have heroes of different classes.
Mm.
Heroes are going to be personable as well, or can be personalized with abilities and equipment. And so, how your hero plays compared to mine, even if it's the same hero, could still be very different based on what you've
Mm.
attributed to them or what you've equipped to them. The second is through Pixion League. So, that's our tournament platform that we're building. And the raise that we've just closed will go some way to helping us build that tournament platform. Essentially, what that is supercharging our live ops. So with one tap, one button, the tournaments are all in app.
Okay.
That gives players the ability to enter into this really exciting event that will be timed, have specific winning conditions, different rules, different rewards. And that acts as a really exciting on ramp for players that want to get involved.
Mm.
Importantly, they make the decision. Do I want to be involved, and what's the reward?
Yeah.
They're able to make that decision for themselves. And so we're bringing in players that are excited about this rather than force feeding or pushing
Mm.
it down their throats.
Yeah, exactly.
The other part is we again were very intentional before we wrote a line of code is how do we build this game with a really deep meta that can provide a route to winning, and winning is defined very differently for different players, but provide a route or multiple routes of winning for these different players with different motivations within the same experience.
Mm.
And that's where we started to blend these two genres together in action RPG and base building strategy because it allowed us to create these really deep meta games and different player lanes for them to go through. We see players that some they don't like to raid. They're not good at raiding, and so they
Mm.
focus all their time on building this impenetrable base.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
The others are really prefer the more action orientated game or side of a game, which is the
Mm.
raiding, and so they focus a lot on upgrading their heroes, spend all their resources on the heroes, and they create a very different experience for themselves compared to the base builder.
Mm.
Uh, Equally, because UGC is a real native component of the game, we're really excited about how those islands that are on chain
Yep.
empower players to create these experiences for other players. And we think that's going to be a really exciting on ramp because if you've got this island and it's an NFT
Mm.
and you're my buddy and I go, cool, John, that's an amazing island and it's one of the islands that have been selected in the speed run for the next Pixion League tournament.
Mm.
And so you've built this cool base, you're accruing value from all the tickets
Yep.
for the Pixion League,
Mm.
and you're also being able to brag about your base being one of a 15 or 20 that have been selected.
Mm-hmm.
We think that's going to be a really strong social mechanic and act as a really strong on ramp for players to go, well, I'd like to also build a base that can be submitted to Pixion League and potentially be used in tournaments. And the beauty for us as a studio is that it creates free revenue streams for three different stakeholders. One, of
Yeah.
course, us as a studio. Two, the actual players that compete in this tournament, the winners. And then three, the actual creators. So you as the base builder who submitted this base and it was selected, you've created this lane for yourself that allows you to accrue value. But importantly, you've created value for the ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not something you can just idly sit back and stake and in 10 months you've 10x'd. And
Yeah.
so that, again, we've been very intentional. And before, like I say, we wrote even a single line of code, there was weeks and weeks and weeks of just constant back and forth of, do we have the right fundamentals from a game design perspective,
Mm.
what we believe the meta could be. And again, we benefited from just observing the space over the last 2 years as well.
Mm. No, I think that is a very sort of clear. There's two sort of clear trends then that you mentioned there. So, I mean, UGC, I think in general within games now, people sort of understand that that is a very powerful mechanic. Sort of quite hard to get it up and running. There is a sort of cold start problem you have with a lot of these sort of things, and obviously building out tools is different to building games. There is a getting tools people can build is not the easiest thing. But anyway, within UGC is sort of powerful. But certainly within blockchain, where there are, as you say, you're allowing people who have different skills to show those skills in a in their own way without having to do lots of things they're not good at. Um, but then it's also um, how you have something that's valuable and it doesn't just sort of sit there as a static asset and you just basically go, oh, I've made tons of money and I'll sort of sell it off. I imagine if you really are good at the creation side, then you're probably you're not creating one island, you're creating a whole bunch, and then then other people are competing to get in the next sort of tournament, so you have to keep updating yours. So there is this sort of idea
Exactly.
that I think games are really good at creating value that people care about, but then the thing developers like you have sort of worked out now is then you have to have some sort of mechanic where people then have to continue to invest. And I don't mean spending tons of money in it, but there is some sort of dynamism around that. And if you just don't do anything with them, then you're just not going to keep up because other people in a competitive. As much as there are competitive players and there's competitive people who build things,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that's the sort of that's the circularity of the economy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, again, we're very intentional with what the actual core loop is, because
Mm,
you're very right in that UGC requires this critical mass.
yeah.
And how do you go from 0 to 100? In between, what's that journey, and how do you create that adoption? And so
Mm,
that's where it was very important for us that without this Pixion League element, and without base builders creating content for these tournaments,
mm,
a core loop, they're already learning about building a base, how to build a base, the different units, uh, just from playing the core loop. And so once we start to introduce those tournaments as an on ramp to further expand that experience and really level up the UGC side of Fableborne, we've already started to build this community. We've already started to educate players on how to build compelling and
mm,
engaging content for others.
yeah.
Now we're just giving them the platform through the tournaments to curate what that experience is before it's shared with other players.
Cool. Good. So coming to the end, I guess the important thing now is sort of if you talk a bit more. I know there's some things you can't say, but sort of where you are in development. You've been running. I think this is your fourth or fifth closed beta you've been doing with the community. Pretty much all this year, you've been sort of releasing builds and letting people get on with it. So what can you say about? I guess we've got 6 months left in 2023. What should we be expecting?
Yeah, so we, like you say, spent the first 6 months really optimizing the core loop. It's something we already validated
Mm,
at the end of last year. And now it was about extending that experience further and adding things like the hot swapping feature for the heroes, allowing you to take more than one hero. So just extending
yeah.
that core loop. We've really focused now on some of the deeper progression systems. You're going to see a much longer tail when it comes to engagement of what you can do within Fableborne. We talked about obviously Pixion League and the tournaments. You'll certainly see that this year.
Okay.
And now we've got the base. I said earlier on we're intentional in not selling any NFTs or selling a token. We're still not going to be introducing any token. Um, but we've got a very clear idea now of what those on-chain assets and how they fit within Pixion League and how they fit within the core loop of Fableborn. So expect to see more information and news about that later this year too.
Okay, cool, good. Within the confines of what you can say, that's exciting, I think. And for people who do want to get involved, I guess Discord is always is the place to go and get a feel for what's going on, and maybe if you're lucky enough, get into some of the testing.
Yes, Fableborne on Twitter or Discord. We've got a test actually next Wednesday, so just over a week's time.
Okay.
It's going to be our last close play test.
Okay.
There's going to be some incredible rewards coming out of that as well. So if anyone's interested, for sure, take a look at Twitter or Discord. That's where myself and the team are most active.
And if that's the last closed test, does that mean there'll be some open tests before too long?
There'll be some open tests in the very near future for sure.
Good, excellent, cool. Well, thank you very much, Kam. That was really good to get a deep dive into what you've been building, and I think this is actually one of the podcasts where we've actually gone the most depth into an actual sort of product. So I think that's sort of quite good from a design point of view. I hope people sort of have enjoyed the way you've sort of gone through the process of thinking about stuff and then adding things in. So thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you for having me. Really, really fun to share our story.
Cool. Good. And thanks to you for watching, listening, however you are consuming the podcast. Hope you are enjoying it. Every episode, we're talking to people who are building out this sort of new way of playing games, of being involved in games, in spending money in games, and maybe making money in games. A whole bunch of stuff all being mixed up, and I think it is fascinating. So everyone's coming up with their own particular flavour. There's a whole bunch of these tools out there. And very few of these games. Well, at least this year. Maybe last year everyone was coming up with the same game, but thankfully we've moved on a bit now, and everyone's sort of using the tools in a slightly different way and coming up with I think something innovative. So please subscribe. Please keep coming back, and see you next time. Goodbye. Oh, I got my little jingle.